Housekeeping. What's due next week? Data Blitz. Okay. So if you're online, here's what the online students are going to do as discussed. Record your presentation. Send a link for a 5-minute max video. If your video is longer than 5 minutes, I'm just going to edit out whatever's on the end of it. Okay? You have 5 minutes. Don't worry about the file type and just drop it to me somehow. Yes? I'm just stopping you. I'm just going to, my phone is going to go off, and I'm going to be like, stop. You have to stop now. It's over. That's fine. Nope. Yeah, but you don't lose marks. You just, whatever you wasn't in your 5 minutes doesn't get marked. If we go overtime, which I hope we won't, we'll just pick up after the break. So if you're one of the lucky people, if we happen to go overtime, we'll just pick up after the break. Does that make sense? Yes. Can you go first? We're going to go alphabetical order, so alphabetical by last name. Okay, so I've had a lot of questions about the talk itself. Tons and tons of questions. Okay. I pulled these up. These are the TED Talk commandments. Tons of people said, can I have notes? Can I have slides? No, you can't have slides. Can you have notes? Yes, you can have notes if you want, but have you ever seen a TED Talk or a really good presentation that had notes, like it was reading off the paper? No, because it's really hard to make it interesting when you're looking at the paper and not interacting with the audience, right? So I just put up the TED Talk commandments. Number 3 and number 4, I'm going to point out, thou shalt reveal thy curiosity and thy passion. I want to know why you're interested in this topic, okay? And thou shalt tell stories. I want to hear a story. I want sort of the 3 pieces. What are the 3 pieces that you have to include in your presentation? Why you pick the topic? Why it's important? And an interesting study or intervention that you might want to talk about, that you're going to talk about, okay? Those things should all fit together into one story. It's a narrative, right? It's not just like, and here's the prevalence of this, and here's why I'm interested, and here's my study, right? Make it interesting. Number 9 and number 10, these are important, and I think I've emphasized them enough. Thou shalt not read thy speech. Thou shalt not steal the time of them that follow thee. Don't steal other people's time, okay? So you can go through the rest of them. They're pretty interesting, and obviously TED is now known as sort of one of those things that is doing presentations really, really well, and this is one of the reasons why. Any questions on the data blitz? Yeah. You can write on the whiteboard if you want, yeah. But you can't have slides pre-programmed on the whiteboard or preloaded. Yeah, well, I want you to actually, well, you can reference a study, but I want you to present a study that you're going to build on. So you don't necessarily have to design a brand new study. Let's say I'm like, I want to do this study, but I want to add this component to it. Or I want to replicate this study. Or I want to replicate this intervention, but I want to add this component. Or I want to do a completely different study, right? You can't just talk about a study that exists. So you need to talk about something new. Okay, so the final comment on this is practice, 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 okay? If you don't practice, I can guarantee you that you will go over 5 minutes, and you're going to not get those marks counted for those things that went over. Time goes by extremely fast when you're up here talking. What was that? Practice, practice, practice? Good. Okay, so for the short report and the final report, I also had a lot of questions about this. As the short report's coming up due after the break, okay? Here's sort of my take on it. How many of the groups have assigned specific sections to specific people in the group and you're kind of working that way? Many, if not most of the groups have sort of said, okay, you know, you work on the intro, you work on the interpretation, you work on the intervention, you work on the evaluation, right? That's important, that's fine, and that's important. But one of the key things that I'm looking for with the short report, and especially with the final report, is to integrate that, right? To integrate the different sections. So here's my thoughts, right? Number 2, person time. if you just think of your standard class, how much time would you put into writing a 3,000-word paper on your own? Let's say you'd put in, I don't know, give me a ballpark. No idea. 10 hours or so? Okay, let's say 10 hours. Okay, what I expect is that the 4 people combined will put in, let's say it's 4 people, they'll put in the equivalent of 10 hours each, 40 hours. So what that means is that even though you might each work on a section, the key piece is that you all work together to integrate into one document, one story, right? One thing that's going to sort of present your case or paint the picture of what you want to present. My approximate guide is approximately 10 iterations between the group before you submit. Okay? So if you just like finish it, slap it all together, and then send it to me, I can guarantee you you haven't put enough work, and it's not going to tell that story that it needs to tell, right? The sections aren't going to be linked together well. It's going to be a little bit disjointed, okay? So that's kind of what the challenges of this paper is. How does your group work together to create a first draft, no shame first draft, and then just work at refining and refining and refining and refining until you have something that's really, really, really polished. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, good. So the short report is due via email midnight on February 24th, and I won't be in class on February 24th. Okay, so you're going to have your biostats review with Ellen Rafferty, and we were working on the class today. It's going to be a lot of fun. So basically one of your group members can email me by midnight on February 24th. Yes?
So you're not going to be in class that day, but if Data Blitz goes over, the presentations will be on that
We'll
day?
go the next.
Oh, the next.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions on anything? Assignments? No? Okay. Online, is there any? How are the readings? How did the readings go? Good. Who did the readings? Who skimmed their readings? Who didn't do their readings? Good. I have one honest soul. So today we're talking about first thing, program planning. Second thing, data, where to get, what to do with it, where to get it. Basically what we're going to sort of work on, you're going to be working in your groups for your assignments, and you're going to start thinking about your intervention and how you're going to evaluate your intervention. Okay, throughout the class we'll have 2 or 3 different activities where you as your group will start doing that. So online students, get ready for when we break out that you'll need to have your contact method for your group, whether that's Google Hangouts or Skype or whatever, and get that fired up. So I'm going to start this class. I'm sort of going to act like your angry Uncle Frank today and talk a little bit about program planning, but I'm also going to acknowledge my biases before we start. So my biases in terms of program planning and evaluation are that I'm a post-positivist. So if you're constructivist, if you do qualitative research, I'm totally ignoring that. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm ignoring that. Quantitative, that's the second thing. And my focus is on outcome evaluation. Okay, so I'm much more focused on outcome evaluation than process evaluation or other types of evaluation that you might want to integrate into your report, but you also might want to play to my biases. Okay, so the first thing that we need to think about is what is evaluation? I'm big on definitions, as you can guess. So this is from Scriven, and this is one definition of evaluation. There's tons of them out there. Evaluation is a systematic investigation of the merit, worth, or significance of an object. So here, what we're talking about in terms of program planning, health program planning and evaluation, what are we trying to decide of? Usually we're evaluating some type of intervention, right? And how do we evaluate the merit, worth, or significance of that intervention? If the goals have been met of the intervention, okay? So those can be sort of process goals. Did we reach our target population? Was the intervention delivered in the way that we expected it to be delivered? So on and so on. There can be outcome goals, right? Those can be, did we change the rates of whatever a certain amount? Did people smoke less? Did people, whatever we want, whatever our outcome is, okay? But a big piece of this is that you kind of get to decide what defines merit, worth, or significance, right? We have sort of methods, and in your program planning sort of logic models and theories, we kind of have a pretty established method of saying, is it worthwhile, is it significant, so on, right? Whether that's statistical or not. Okay, and then we have logic models. Program planning, memory. What are like the classic logic models of program planning? If you look at that definition. Anybody remember any of those? Some heads are going up and down. Can you shout them out? What are the logic models of program planning? Common ones that we use in program planning. Different logic models. Logic model is sort of the broad term to encompass lots of those different kind of program planning devices or mechanisms or arrows and boxes that we use. Okay, but I'm thinking about like precede, proceed. Does that ring any bells? Re-aim, does that ring any bells? Re-aim? Precede, proceed, yes. Re-aim, no? Okay. What? You didn't do re-aim. Okay, good. So we'll talk a little bit about re-aim, but we're not going to spend too much time on it. So basically, and there's the logic model, right? The sort of classic 4 boxes. Have you done that? Yes? Okay. So basically, these are sort of ways that we try to organize information, right? And they're supposed to help us because they get us to think about the different aspects, and they get us to draw boxes and arrows and so on. Who has used a logic model in real life, in their real work? A couple people? 2, 3 people? Online? Has anyone used a logic model? Tamara has. Awesome. Okay, but like most of this class, what we're trying to think about is, what's the point of a logic model? Like, why did we learn about logic models, and why did we learn about precede, proceed, and why do we use them? Why do we think that they might be valuable? So when we look at the Wikipedia, Wikipedia talks about the assumptions of logic models. And basically what we're trying to do is say, what are the causal relationships between certain inputs, activities, outputs, and others? So we're trying to say, if I do this, then that will happen, right? If I do some smoking intervention, people will smoke less at the broadest level of my smoking intervention. At a more narrow level of my smoking intervention, I might say, if I have a one-on-one smoking cessation program with a client, they will smoke 6% less, right? I can say my intervention broadly or my intervention very narrowly, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So that's what we want to do. How do we go about figuring out if we can make a statement like, if I do this intervention, then I will cause less smoking? Where do we get the information we need to make a statement like that? Statistics? Yeah, and where do statistics usually go? They usually get published, right? So we have some statistics that are published, some intervention research that's published, some epi studies that are published that say, okay, this is the association or this is the effect of this intervention on that outcome, right? So we can go to the literature. Where else can we go? Yep. Yeah, the mic.
Just program indicators. If you're already running a program and you wanted to check in on how it's been doing over the last 5 years, you would look at your outcome statistics, and if you wanted to revamp your logic model based on what you know from that, you can redesign your processes.
Okay, so we're going through, basically we're doing some sort of process evaluation to change our intervention, right? So we're using our own intervention as a feedback loop into some redesign of our intervention, okay? If we have stakeholders, if we're designing a new intervention, we have stakeholders that are involved, we might want to ask them what they might want, right? And work with them to sort of design and build an intervention. Okay, we could also ask experts. We could just send an email out to 10 experts in the field of intervention research that we're interested in and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing an intervention that looks like this. What do you think? Because it might be quicker and easier than going to the published literature, right? Maybe I don't have the skills. Maybe I don't have institutional access to all of the journals in my health region. I can just email some experts and say, what do you think of this? Do you think this is appropriate? They're going to give you their opinion, I'm sure. Okay, so basically what we're trying to do is make a causal statement. If this, then that will happen. Okay? And that's really important. So here's sort of an example, and this is from your paper, okay, of our logic model. We have all our different 4 boxes on the top that I cut off. We have implementation, reach, adoption, implementation, maintenance, that's re-aim. We have our different outcomes, behaviors, effectiveness. We have all of these different elements, okay? But what we're really trying to do is make that causal statement, right? So here, if we look at that arrow, basically an arrow is an if-then statement, right? An arrow is this will cause this. So if I look at implementation, develop rules and or plan for implementation, distribute resources, train and support implementers, implement rules and or plan. So implementation, what they're saying, will cause reach, will reach our intended population. Implementation will cause adoption of our intervention, and implementation will cause implementation as intended, acceptable, feasible, so on. Does that make sense? Can implementation cause implementation? Greg, what do you think? I think it's a funny question.
Possibly implementation of one step could lead to the implementation of another step. So it's probably like a subgroup of the bigger picture.
Okay, so it might be implementation related to acceptability, feasibility, and cost, right? You might think of it that way, okay? We're going to get into this a little bit more in terms of how we think about and critique, because I'm going to critique them, logic models. Okay, so that's basically our logic model. Now, one thing we didn't talk about when we talked about where do we get that information to justify our if-then statements was this thing called theory. Oh yeah, the Carpiano paper, Carpiano and Daly. Okay, was that a hard paper? Does it make sense? Did you breeze through it and you're just like, yeah, totally understood every single thing that was going on there? No. Okay, I teach that paper to a PhD class and no one understands what's going on, right? But basically what we want to think about is that our logic model is kind of like a theory. But the way we think about theory and the way we think about logic models, oftentimes we don't make the connection between those two things. Logic models want to make causal statements. Theories want to make causal statements. But theories have other properties that are good about them, right? So here we have theory is logically related propositions that aim to explain and predict a fairly general set of phenomena. So basically we're saying, okay, this will cause this will predict this, some general thing. And they allow for the systematization of knowledge, prediction, as well as generating new research hypotheses. That's exactly what our logic model does. Our logic model gives us an opportunity to write everything down, put everything on paper, and say, okay, here's what I need to do for my intervention. It's kind of what a theory does. The big difference between a theory and a logic model is that we have these criteria for evaluating whether a theory is good or bad, okay? And we don't really have good criteria for evaluating whether a logic model is good or bad, right? We just kind of put these 4 boxes and put all these arrows and say, okay, this is fine. We'll just run with this intervention. But a theory gives us sort of these 5 criteria for evaluating whether it's good or not. It has to be logical. So the major concepts in relation should be logically and clearly defined conceptually and operationally. So if I say a conceptual definition and operational definition, do you know what those words mean? What's a conceptual definition?
The way that I kind of understand it is conceptual is more just the abstract. Like on paper, we'll say this is how it should work, but without, and then operationally is in real life, we've got a bunch of other factors that will actually happen. But, I mean, sorry,
yeah, you're very close. You're very close. So your conceptual definition is right. It's how we describe something on paper. What is it? How do we describe it in 2 or 3 sentences? Our operational definition is how we go about measuring the thing, the concept that we're trying to measure. Okay? So if we use the example of, I don't know, use the example of diabetes. We have some conceptual definition of diabetes, right, that has some criteria about insulin. And then we have a whole bunch of different operational definitions of diabetes. We can measure it through asking you can say, do you have diabetes? Has a doctor told you have diabetes, yes or no? We can do blood tests. We can do saliva tests. We can do all kinds of different things to answer that question of do you have diabetes or not, okay? With sort of harder health outcomes, the relationship is a little bit more clear. With more nebulous outcomes like gender, okay, so we have some definition of gender, right, that says something like it's a spectrum of, you know, maleness and femaleness and how we exhibit those traits, right? Then how do we measure that? Most of the time in public health literature, you'll see they'll say, what's your gender, male or female? Or are they measuring gender? No, they're measuring sex. So we oftentimes get into this challenge of our conceptual definition is really hard to operationalize, really hard to sort of put on paper in a survey or in a qualitative interview or something like that. So that's one thing that's important. We need to know what we're measuring conceptually and operationally. So we need to know how to measure it on paper. So causality, again, we have this notion of causality. This relates back to epi. This relates back to our logic models. We need to sort of say this will happen and then this will happen. This will be the cause of this. This will be the cause of that. Falsification. So at least some of the major propositions should be empirically falsifiable. What is that? How do you interpret that? So empirical means we have to have some sort of scientific way to say, no, it's not good, right? We need to have some sort of scientific method. We need to know what the propositions are. So we need to know sort of what the if and then is. So what's our if then if we go back to our smoking. We go back to our soda ban from our New York case study that we did a couple weeks ago. In the smoking ban, one of the sort of causal propositions that they used was to say, you drink a lot of pop, right? And because so many people drink pop, it becomes more available in the environment. Lots of people drinking pop causes more people to be more accessible in the environment, and increased accessibility in the environment causes people who don't necessarily drink pop to drink more pop. Okay, that's sort of the simplest causal chain before we get there. So we have 2 propositions. If lots of people in the environment drink pop, pop will be more available in the environment. Lots of people drinking pop causes pop to be available in the environment. Then pop being available in the environment causes people who wouldn't necessarily drink pop to drink pop. Now, what if we wanted to test whether lots of people drinking pop causes more pop to be in the environment, empirically, with scientific methods? Could we do that?
I don't know. Like it'd be tough. Like you could use like data on like sales and stuff like that to see like if like the rates are actually going up, like if people are consuming it more. But I don't really know how you would, like on an individual level, say like how you're drinking. I guess maybe surveys or something.
Okay, so the main point is like
it's
kind of tough, but the main point is you could come up with an experiment that would falsify this, that would prove that the claim was right or wrong. right? Whether you could actually, the experiment was actually feasible, or you had enough money, or you had all of those things, is less important. The most important thing is that you could actually come up with an experiment that would show that lots of people in the environment drinking pop causes more pop in the environment. Then we have something that's falsifiable. Getting a lot of blank stares. Okay. What's some, Give me one of the group's topics. One of the groups. Start with your topic. Okay, childhood obesity. We're still on the obesity thing. So what are some of the sort of statements about childhood obesity? So what are the things that you're seeing in your research so far? You had tons of interventions. We talked about interventions last time, 3 classes ago. What types of interventions are you? Yeah. What types of interventions are you looking at, or what is the prevalence incidence of childhood obesity kind of look like?
Okay, well, the prevalence is different between boys and girls. It's higher in girls, and we're looking at ages 5 to 11, so in children.
Okay.
Prevalence is higher in girls in Canada. Some of the interventions we've seen are school-based, so that's a combination of education and changing the foods that are available in schools and having educators within the schools. We've seen...
Can I stop you?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the sort of scientific or otherwise explanations that try to explain why there's more obesity or obesity rates are higher in boys than girls?
They're thinking maybe genetics.
Okay.
Some of it.
Something about genetics?
Yep.
Okay. So broadly speaking, if we just break that down into like a big cause and effect, you could say genetics cause obesity. Right? You could say that, right? And the idea is, if that's a valid theory, if that's a good theory, what we need to be able to do is test whether genetics does actually cause obesity or not. And like I said, we don't necessarily need to be able to do the specific experiment, but we need to be able to think of an experiment or design an experiment that would test that. Is that slightly more clear?
And that makes it empirical.
And that makes it falsifiable. So let's say the counterexample is something that's not falsifiable. So something that's not falsifiable would be, let's see, something you can't test, but something you can't even really measure, like aliens cause space dust. Yep. Exactly. So that's another example. Say that again.
So one of the non-falsifiable examples would be sunrise in the east. You can't really falsify it, right?
The sun rises in the east, so it's hard to falsify, right? Every day, it's just there. How would you could, in theory, design some kind of experiment, but it would be relatively hard to falsify that. Yep. Right. You have the ability to prove whether the theory is right or wrong, whether that causal link, this thing to this thing, is right or wrong. And if there's no way that you can do that, then it's not a very good theory. Okay, so the other pieces of the theory, the two other ways that we evaluate theory out of the 5 are scope. So the theory has to try to explain a broad set of phenomenon in a relatively simple way. So we're trying to simplify the world, basically. We're trying to say, generally speaking, this is what happens. So our classic example is social cognitive theory. People learn social cognitive theory? Yes, no? Actually, this is a good example of potentially non-falsifiability. So what does social cognitive theory say? I'll just put okay. There is social cognitive theory. It says that behaviors interact with the environment, interact with psychological factors, interact with behaviors, and we just have this continuous feedback loop. Okay, it gets more in detail, particularly when we talk about psychological factors and talks about self-efficacy and talks about intentions and talks about all those other things down in here. And it talks a bit about behaviors and talks about the environment a little bit. When we look at that, those arrows. So the arrows mean cause, right? They say psychological factors cause behavior, and behavior causes psychological factors. Psychological factors cause the environment causes psychological factors, and behaviors cause the environment, and so on. So if you look at that, is that falsifiable? You prove that wrong. No? Why? What's hard about proving it wrong?
Well, like what kind of environment, what kind of behaviors? It's just there's too much.
Well, this is the scope of the theory, right? This is the whole point of scope. It's trying to explain a lot with not a lot, right?
Yeah.
A large set of phenomena with not very many sort of interactions.
That's why I think you can't prove it wrong, because there's just so many different things to consider.
Exactly. So there's a ton of different things to consider. It'd be really hard to sort of prove this large theory wrong, right? But if we sort of narrowed it down and said, does self-efficacy predict physical activity behavior, and is that modified by the environment, right? We could probably say, yeah, we can test that, right? So we have this challenge with the scope, trying to explain a lot of phenomenon with not a lot of variables, not a lot of relationships, and whether it's falsifiable or not, whether we can actually falsify the theory. Okay, and that's 5 is productivity, so that's the same thing we were just talking about. Promote non-obvious implications and produce relatively large number of predictions per assumption. Okay, so the main sort of point that I'm trying to get across here is in your logic model or in your theory, if you're using a specific theory for your intervention, some of you might, lots of groups last year used some sort of psychological theory for a behavior change type intervention, trans-theoretical model or something like that in the sort of scope of health behavior change. What I'm trying to get across with the logic model and the theory is the arrows really matter. Like you're saying that one thing causes another thing when you draw an arrow. That means that you have to have pretty good evidence or really solid backing to sort of justify drawing that arrow. Right? If we think to epi, the whole point of epi is to sort of identify causes, right? That's our main goal in epi. And we know that that's a big debate. We know that it's really hard to find causes. But then when we jump into program planning, we just sort of draw arrows and boxes willy-nilly and go, yeah, this is perfect, this is going to work, no problem. But if we step back and put on our sort of epi hat, we go, man, I don't know. I don't know if this actually causes this. That's hard to know, right? So the main sort of point or main reflection to try to think about is in your logic model or whatever type of theory you're using, when you draw an arrow, really think about whether or not that arrow is justified. And if you can't, you either have to erase the arrow or change one of the variables or modify one of the variables. Just like we saw with social cognitive theory a second ago, maybe we can't do it with behavior broadly speaking. Maybe we don't have good causal evidence, but maybe we can narrow the behavior and say, okay, well, we're going to look at, smoking, or we're going to look at physical activity, or we're going to look at sexual activities or something like that. I'm going to skip this part. Actually, no, I'm not. Okay, so when we're talking about theory, we have sort of this conceptual framework. This is sort of the biggest category of theory. These are our logic models. These are sort of like lots of boxes, lots of arrows. We don't really know what's going on. Basically, what we're trying to do is identify a set of variables and relationships between those variables. Okay, we're just saying this thing is correlated with this thing. We don't necessarily have to have an arrow. We can just say, draw a line, that's a correlation. We're happy with that. Then in theory, we say, okay, we want more variables. We want them to be more logically coherent, and we want to start drawing arrows. We want to draw causes. Okay, we want causes. And then in a model, we make more specific assumptions. So here we go. In a model, we go from sort of that social cognitive theory idea of psychological factors, behavior, environment, to self-efficacy, physical activity, you know, winter cycling or something. And that's sort of what it looks like in the Carpiano paper. And this is sort of what it would look like if we had an example. So a framework might be our social environment causes an individual response. That's exactly our our soda ban example, right? The environment that you're in causes you to drink more pop. The environment causes an individual response. You drink more pop, and then you have a change in health outcome or some change in function, right? So that would be the framework. They would say some social environment factor causes some individual response, causes some change in health. And then the theory might say resources in the social environment, so whether I have access to good health care, causes a change in health behaviors, which causes some outcome, right? So my access to emergency healthcare services causes me to get in more accidents, I don't know, you know, have more injuries. That causes me to have bad health outcomes because of my injuries. And then a model would say neighborhood food quality, so the quality of food that's in my neighborhood predicts my diet, which predicts whether or not I'm going to be obese, right? So neighborhood food quality causes diet, which causes obesity. Obviously, these are very simple and very linear, but these are the types of sort of predictions or assumptions that you're making. It's the same thing with your intervention. So with your intervention, essentially what you might do with an intervention is say, we're changing neighborhood food quality, right? We're intervening to change neighborhood food quality, which is going to change dietary practices, which is going to change obesity, right? So we always kind of make the same assumption when we talk about intervention. We say we change one thing and we get an effect on another outcome, right? So we change neighborhood food quality, we change dietary practice, we change obesity. Does that make sense? Getting a lot of nods, positive nods. It's good. So here's the other thing that's important, and that I'm going to, through your short report and through your final report, I'm going to challenge you to think about is that evaluations, your logic models, or your interventions, or whatever you're talking about, has theory behind it. You have some assumptions behind most of, or almost all of those sort of health relationships that you talk about. Whether you explicit them or not, they're still there, right? So what we need to do is we need to try to be explicit about our assumptions. So when we read that soda ban case study, the author wasn't really explicit about those causal assumptions of neighborhood food quality or access to soda changes dietary practices, changes obesity, right? That wasn't sort of clearly laid out in that article. And it's very clear, it's very rarely is it clearly laid out in sort of any type of intervention study that you read, right? You see that, they say, we're going to change this, and it's going to cause this, and it's going to cause this. No, it's just sort of implicitly there. Well, we're going to do this and this and this. We're going to do an individual-based intervention, and we're going to do social marketing, and we're going to do some political campaign, and all of those three things are going to result in change in dietary practice and then change in obesity, right? But we need to sort of explicit that in our intervention. What about the individual behavior change is going to change? What components of the individual behavior change intervention are going to change dietary practice? What components of the public policy are going to change dietary practice? And how are they going to change it? And how much are they going to change it? Okay, and then the last thing is, like we've talked about throughout the whole the whole course and probably your whole MPH. Evaluation must be tailored to context. So obviously you're working with stakeholders and you're tailoring your intervention to context, but I would argue not too much. Because one of the things that we're trying to do sort of as researchers and as public health practitioners is to take the best evidence and apply that to our context. But if we take the best evidence and we take all the good parts away and we just adapt it to context, then we end up with something that doesn't really work. And we go, well, why didn't this work? Oh, because you took all the good parts away. You forgot about all the theoretical assumptions, because they're implicit, and just adapted it to context and lost everything. We're going to talk about that more. Okay, so your group work, 20 minutes. Define a conceptual model for your intervention. So in your groups for your short report and final project, try to define a conceptual model for your intervention. So what are the boxes and arrows? What causes what? What are the outcomes? What are the activities? What are the outputs? Draw the causal links between variables. And then think about how much does one activity / output change the outcome. So let's say, for example, you're working in some sort of sexual health intervention, and you do a public awareness campaign around condom use. Well, you have to say, okay, how much is my public awareness campaign around condom use going to change condom use in my target population? So you have to sort of try to give me a number of that, 10%, 20%, whatever. So you might have to start thinking about, okay, is there literature on this? Have we found literature on this? Is it out there? So on. Ready? Go.
Okay, so then my time for you is to say, what I don't know, I just start trying out what I just want to know. Because right now what you're doing is just kind of snowballing, footballing, this, so you have to need this, you need to do this, but start trying and even how to make it together. Because that's going to help. At least get something on paper, and at least then you can sort of say, oh, maybe I can make it. You could always make more sense when you don't have to go crazy, just like start putting something down on paper. This is what cause this, and this is like this, and this is that. And again, that's what I want. Okay, so where are you now? Okay. So how would you know whether it needs maintenance? Yeah. So that might be a good position. So yeah, we need to think about different ways to reduce the rate value. And then what are those interventions look like? Like what do we do now in breast cancer that sort of stabilize the rate of breast cancer? Okay, and then what happens after that? Okay, and then what do they do? Right. Well, that's a screening policy for the matter. Right, and that's the difference. So yeah, you have to say kind of issue, and the US ones, they just kind of not getting this right now. And that's sort of the idea that the Canadian guideline is a bit older, because it's because the older you are, the more likely there is to become kind of benefit. Starting at 50 rather than starting at 40. So that's something to think about in terms of reducing mortality rate. Well, maybe starting at 50 is fine for cost benefit, but it doesn't necessarily do anything for mortality, right? then what's the alternative to food, like form of food, you know? Okay, what's the more sort of low cost, lower risk, type of healthy kind of food and stuff? Yeah, that's not good. You gotta go to the doctor. So then what do we need to do more to decrease? I mean, this is the part, right? Let's try to think about, okay, what is the outcome? What is the type of intervention? So if you go to those modifiable risk factors, right, your sort of causal argument is you need to be clear on the causal argument. So you're saying that sort of with this diet causes something about breast cancer, right? It causes like less tumors, smaller tumors, something. Earlier stage diagnosis, I don't know how that is, right? Like what does that arrow specifically mean? You can have an arrow with no, you can have an arrow with no, you can have a line with no arrow that's like correlated. This is correlated with this. So we don't know what's the right. Okay? They should be connected with the group. They should be connected.
Okay, just a note. If you have online students in your class, you should be connecting with them or connected with them through chat or Skype or whatever. So like, if your group has online people, get them included, please. Thank you. Will cause us to catch more latency cases, which will cause
electricity, and then the second one is among Aboriginal population, mobile streaming programs have caused less latency and potentially TV and download activity and has caused So yeah, that's where kind of I want to push you to try to go is to say, okay, this thing, this streaming program, this is going to cause that, this is going to cause that. Because so far you made the jump, like, just in what you just described, you made the jump from mobile streaming to live TV. And it's like, well, there's probably some steps in between there that we might want to think about. Because those steps are really like, logical and or not, but also potentially successful and or not. And a lot of times what you'll see with lots of interventions is just say, this can work, and then they do it and it doesn't work, and they're like, oh, no, it can work. Because you need to think about what you're trying to do, right? Exactly. So it's the middle part that we're talking about. Yeah, and I've brought up, even when you're just talking amongst yourselves, like one of you or two of you, you start to brought it up. It's okay. Streaming program. First person streaming. There's that outcome. There's my outcome. So my outcome, how do I get from the lower to the
Okay, 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes. What groups haven't I talked to?
For the purpose of this exercise, what we're trying to think about is, okay, then, right, so then within here to here, okay, so we're going to have increased awareness of programming savings, and then we're going to have causes, decrease in need of reach. Right, so that's kind of my point, okay, so when you think about, like, this causing this, increased awareness causing less ego use. What is it about the awareness that causes less use, and how can we try to maximize the strength of that awareness so that this will actually really cause the behavior? Because we just say, we're going to do the program, and the program is going to cause less use, so we're not even going to think about the program. We're just going to implement the program and say, yeah, then we implemented the program, and it's going to cause behavior change. Yeah. Good. 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 That's it. Keep going. Don't let talk. This week, I haven't talked to you. How's it going? Oh, you even had a PowerPoint? New campaign. Okay. Okay. Please. So if you take it out, you'll reduce accessibility outcomes. Here, I would argue sort of that you're so driving that we're making is like some education campaign causes increased knowledge and awareness of the dangers of disease, which causes reduced accessibility. And I say, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Increased knowledge of the dangers causes reduced accessibility. But the point is to say, but the point is to say, maybe we need to break it out and say, we want to still include reduced accessibility as an outcome, but we need to think about what kind of campaign might result in that outcome. Accessibility. Okay. That's fine. I think that's okay. But that's a lot of stuff. Right? So remember that, like, or just separate them out into completely separate things. Like have two separate kind of interventions going on at once. You could have one that would be your education campaign and one that would be your policy campaign. You have to have one intervention that can be as big as nice. Yeah. Exactly what it's conceptual. So when you think about evaluating, so the first part of the project is evaluating. One of the challenges, one of the things that makes it really hard to do this type of approach is it's really hard to evaluate because like, how do you measure policymakers, community, social makeup, blah, blah, how do you measure those things? It's going to be easier to measure something that you have a specific way of operational and to stuff, right? systematic review method. You don't have to do proper systematic review. No.
Okay, folks, let's take a 10-minute break. So we'll come back at 5 minutes to 3, and then we'll get going again.
he said that the things that we should support units like after that in the fall, that they're not doing the fixed time. Exactly, that's excellent. So basically what I think we're going to do is really just going to we may go to certification in the form of a certificate that I make that says it's certified, which is essentially what Dr. Lynn does, right? Like it's not we took a school course and we say that we're okay. So, I mean, yeah, and I mean, the main point of the, to me, I mean, you're saying that the lecture is kind of, but the main point of the lecture to me is that you learn stuff. Not that you learn stuff. I assume that you already know enough about the statistics side to sort of do almost on the first, and then maybe what we'll have to do is, if you can't get a lab that's big enough, we'll just do the buddy system, and say, okay, we can find a lab that's on the computer, we'll work with the buddy. So we can find that, because we can potentially look into it all along. You almost have to take that one. Just think about it, talk to two people and say, what do you want to get out of it? And then we can talk about that. Because I know that things from that course that I would put things out and put different things in and all the time. So. Well, I don't know what. Yeah, it's going to be March for sure, but let's just start with some kind of outline, and then we can work on it and stuff like that. Yeah. You figure that. That's what we really need to find out. But if you can find out a possible date where most people are available, and then the computer app stuff, and then we'll just work on it. We could, yeah. So your Britain is in the side. So this is like my only block of time that's like more to it. It's fun.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry. Hang on. Okay, folks, are we ready? Online, can you hear me? Can they see me?
Yeah, we can see you.
Yes and yes.
Can hear you as well. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Okay, so how did that little group exercise go? It was hard. Why? You can't just say things like it's hard. Don't pass that.
Our group found it hard because our intervention that we think we're going to go with is complex, but there's multiple papers on it because it's been going on for so long. So then it's hard to know. We had struggled with identifying more outputs.
Right. Okay. And when you say complex, what do you mean by complex?
Like it's kind of got a little bit of everything. So it's a school-based one, but it's got family involved, it's got the kids at school, it's got the teachers, it's got outside staff, plus it's got...
And
like
their intervention looked at not just say physical activity as an activity or health education, it was both of them together. That's where they got their results from, is looking at them both combined.
Right.
And then just one activity.
Okay, so there's like a combined outcome that we're not really sure how to operationalize or what it means, right?
Yeah.
And there's all these different components that are hard to pick apart. It's like all of these things together kind of make a change in
an outcome. But individually, it's really hard to say this activity does this output, which leads to this outcome.
Exactly, and that's precisely what we're going to talk about right now.
Wonderful.
Okay, so we have all of these. You're familiar with logic models. You've used them all the time. You may or may not know precede, proceed, and re-aim, and ecological models. So ecological models are just sort of like individual, interpersonal, community, policy, so on and so on, right? There's 5 or so of them out there. And these are all things that we sort of learn in public health as being useful tools for helping us develop interventions. And just like we heard, this idea of sort of multi-level or multi-pronged interventions that try to target sort of individual behaviors and families and communities and schools. In public health, we often make the assumption that those types of interventions are going to be better than some type of individual-only intervention or some sort of policy-only intervention, right? People generally agree with that, okay? I'm going to say I disagree, okay? And we're going to talk about why. So we have some of the challenges that we have with these types of tools and this assumption that many different levels of intervention will have a greater impact than one specific intervention at one level, come from 2 sort of basic points, I would say. Not enough theory and too much recipe. So you already started sort of thinking about the theory part, and just as that group pointed out, the real hard part is you have this big intervention that's doing all of these things, but it's really hard to pick out what specific piece of the intervention actually changes what piece of the outcome, right? We know that generally the intervention kind of works on some outcome. But what if we adapted our intervention to the context and we took out the only piece that worked? Let's say there's 10 pieces. One piece works, we adapt it to the context, we take it out, and then we deliver almost the same intervention to a different group, and it doesn't work. We go, well, what happened? Why didn't it work this time? It worked last time. Well, it's because we're sort of changing the pieces of the intervention, right? We'll talk a little more about that. And then the other part is too much recipe. So we sort of follow the logic model a little bit blindly. We just draw boxes and arrows, and we don't think about the implications of drawing a box. One thing causes another thing, right? And that's really important. So when I talk about not enough theory, this is exactly sort of what I think a lot of the groups struggled with and sort of started to go, oh, how are we going to do that? How are we going to operationalize and measure this, right? First of all, our relationships aren't well defined, so we draw, like you saw in the logic model, a whole bunch of different items in a box, in a big box in the logic model, cause a whole bunch of different items in another big box in a logic model. And there's a whole bunch of assumptions in those two big boxes and in that cause that we're not thinking about, and we really need to think about, right? If we want to know what's happening with our interventions, or if we want to know about the process, and if we want to be able to explain why our intervention worked or didn't work. Because that's sort of the big challenge with lots of the multi-level interventions. When they work, it's great. When they don't work, you try to explain why it didn't work, and you go, no idea. I can't explain why it didn't work. The second point is this idea of causal mechanisms for change poorly defined. So here's, it's sort of, I call it the active ingredient. So we need to know what the active ingredient is. I think, who said apple? Yeah, we need to know specifically what the sort of causal mechanism or what the piece of the intervention that's actually causing the change. So let's take that school obesity example. In that intervention, there's probably some family support for healthier eating and being more active. There's a school-based intervention where the kids are probably doing more physical activity and taking more breaks. There's community-level intervention. Maybe there's like a walking school bus or something that's getting the kids to school, all of these things. But what is it about specifically about the intervention that's causing a change in the physical activity? Is it the walking school bus because they actually walk, or is it the recess? And if we try to break it down, which component explains which amount of physical activity? So maybe the walking school bus explains 80% of the increase in physical activity, and the family part explains 10%, and the increased recess explains 10%. So if we want to implement a simplified intervention, we'll just say, well, let's do the walking school bus. That kind of makes sense? The other thing I think that we often do is we make terrible assumptions about intervention effect size. We have rose-colored glasses on, and we're like, we're going to do this, and it's going to work so well. It's going to be awesome. So all of the people who are doing sort of health behavior change type interventions, right? All of those groups, you kind of know who you are. Everyone makes the assumption that some type of awareness education causes some type of behavior change. Okay? Does anyone know, give me a ballpark number, how much does increased awareness change behavior, generally speaking, when you talk about a whole bunch of different health behaviors? It's like 100%, you have increased awareness and you immediately change behavior. 5%, okay, that's a bit low. 20, anybody else? If you had to say less than 50, would you say less than 50? You had to say more than 50. So most people say less than 50, and that's probably about right. Like it's somewhere between 20 and 30, right? So we're saying, okay, between 20 and 30% of increased awareness causes increase in behavior. Is that good or bad? It's not that good, right? So when we're thinking about these types of health education interventions, it's not to say that they don't work. They do work, right? They just don't work very, very well. And actually, no interventions work all that well when we're talking about these broad kind of public health interventions, right? But one of the things that we need to be really realistic about is how much change we think we're going to cause. Because if we have our rose-colored glasses on and we think, this intervention is going to change the world, as my one group put it, as one of the groups put it, we sort of shoot ourselves in the foot because we're not realistic about where we're going and what we're doing. And then the last one is that exact assumption about multi-level interventions. So I think I'm critical of, and I think you as a group need to be sort of critical of, do these multi-level interventions, are we actually justified in assuming that they're always better than some type of individual or some type of policy intervention? So I'll take smoking bans as my example, okay? The effect of banning smoking in public places in every country that's done them has been massive. It's massive on coronary heart disease, stroke, asthma, all types of different outcomes. But it's a single level intervention that says, no, you can't smoke in public, right? That intervention is as good or better than all of our sort of individual behavior change interventions. It's at one level, it's just like, no, can't smoke in public. So you need to think about what type of intervention you're implementing, and don't always assume that that behavior change bit is going to be the best, right? Let's think about how we can intervene at lots of different levels. But again, be realistic about the assumptions and what we're doing. So this example is sort of like soup. I will use this example. Talk about interventions. So you go to the fridge one day, and you have whatever's in your fridge. Take a second, think about your fridge right now. What's in your fridge? No, seriously, I'm serious. What's in your fridge right now? Think about that, okay? Now, I challenge you, you have to take whatever's in your fridge and make a soup out of it, okay? So you go and you make your soup. Think about what you're going to make, what kind of soup you're going to make. Okay, and it's the best soup you've ever had in your life. It's absolutely amazing, okay? You don't write anything down. You don't do anything. You don't sort of remember what you did. And then the next day you go to your fridge and you're like, oh, yesterday I made the best soup ever. Today I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to my fridge. I'm going to take whatever I have and I'm going to make a soup, okay? And then you make that soup, and it's the worst thing you've ever had in your life, right? Well, how do you know what made the soup really good and what made the other soup really bad? Like, how can you sort of try to get an idea of that? It's the ingredients in the soup. Okay. Is that your only comment? I'll just keep running, or Tamara will keep running. Okay, it's the ingredients in the soup are important. So maybe the first day you used up everything good that you had in your fridge, and then the next day you're like, well, I don't have anything good left, so I'm just going to make whatever, right? Okay. Yeah. What else might influence it?
The time you've taken to let certain things simmer together.
Okay, so the amount of time that I have. Assume we have the same amount of time for both soups. Yeah, what else? Okay, so how hungry you were or not. Yeah, good.
Which day you made it? If you made it Monday, then it would taste better. But if you made it Tuesday.
Okay, so what's the causal argument there? The causal argument is Monday you're all relaxed. Tuesday you're like, oh my God, I'm so busy. Maybe the weather's really crappy on Monday, and maybe the weather's really nice on Monday and it's really crappy on Tuesday. Right, exactly. Yeah.
The measurements of ingredients?
Sorry, what?
The measurements of ingredients.
The measurement of ingredients. So what ingredients went in, right? Not only necessarily what we have, but how much of what we had. Okay, what about how good a cook I am? Do you think if I'm like a really bad cook, I could have just really fluked it out. But if I'm a really good cook, I might get a better result on both days, right? Because I'll know more about how to pair ingredients, more about how to match ingredients, more about how to do that, okay? The whole point of the soup example is to sort of say, when you think about a big multi-level public health intervention, you need to think about like the pieces that are going in, so the ingredients in the soup, the ingredients in the intervention, and how those might change the outcome, so how those might influence whether the soup is good or not, right? And there's a lot of factors that sort of go into it, but we need to think more broadly than just about the ingredients. We need to think about whether I'm a good cook, that's sort of the context, whether the weather's ugly or not, again, that's sort of the context. We need to think about what kind of ingredients we have available. If I have, access to, if my kitchen is always stocked with the highest quality ingredients, that's going to be different than if I have like a bachelor fridge that has beer and cheese and bread in it, right? That's going to influence what I can do. So we really need to think about how we evaluate and how we understand what goes in and how that affects what goes out. That make sense? Okay, so that was the first part. So that's not enough theory. So we need more sort of theory, more thinking about why it's important and what it means to draw an arrow, right? When we draw an arrow, we say this causes this. That's a big statement, right? The second part is too much recipe. So we get lost in the simplicity and the sort of niceness of a logic model, and we say, okay, all of these things, and we're just going to draw the arrows, and it's going to be really pretty, and that's all great, right? And we work to follow the templates and the logic models, and we don't really think about it, all right? So this is the example, and it's not a long one, but it's like Pinterest fails. It's exactly that thing, right? We take the logic model, we just say, oh, I'm going to do that, and then we try to do it, and we end up with something that's not what we thought, right? There you go. Sour Patch Kids. So we need to be sort of critical about, again, what makes the difference between that beautiful Sour Patch cake and the fail on the bottom? How do we explain that? Okay, one person obviously is a much more skilled baker than the other person. Okay. What else? Okay, they probably have different ingredients, particularly the icing. If you want to criticize the Pinterest fails, they never get the icing right, right? And that icing is really hard because it's like, how consistent is it? How fluffy is it? How runny is it? And it's always too runny on the Pinterest fails, right? Okay, good. So the basic idea is sort of two things. Be critical about drawing arrows with yourself. Be realistic and self-critical or group critical about drawing an arrow. And don't just fill in a logic model to fill in a logic model. Okay? Think about what the implications are of drawing that arrow and what specific pieces go into those boxes. Because it's really hard to have a bunch of different elements in a box causing a bunch of other different elements in a box. There's so many assumptions that are behind all those elements. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about today is how we evaluate interventions. Okay? I have it up there. If I was just going to ask you right now, evaluate your public health intervention, what would you say? Would you say before and after study? How many people would say before and after study? How many people would say something else? What would you say? What would be your intervention? How would you evaluate your intervention? Okay, a process evaluation. Good. Chris, how did you evaluate? Okay, and why is it awful? You're there. Okay, so cluster randomized control trial. That's what Chris would do. Okay, and we're going to do a little slight deviation. So oftentimes we sort of have this distinction in public health. There is often a distinction that research and evaluation are two different things. Okay, has anyone heard this? Has anyone heard that like research and evaluation are not the same? Yeah, some people know. Okay, and the quote here basically says, the purpose of evaluation is to improve the existing program for the target population, while research is intended to prove a theory or hypothesis. We just talked about theories and hypotheses a little bit. And we're talking about, and the evaluation is talking about improving an existing program, okay? Cool. And then here's sort of a little graphical representation of that, what the difference is between research and evaluation. In my opinion, again, I'm cranky Uncle Frank today, there's no difference between research and evaluation, okay? And that one of the things that I think is really detrimental is this notion that research and evaluation are different and we need to think differently about that. Because essentially, I just don't see the distinction between research and evaluation. In research, we always care about the process. We always care about the outcome of the intervention. We always want to change the intervention. It's just that oftentimes we use sort of more scientific methods-oriented types of interventions, cluster randomized control trials, that type of thing, versus before and after studies, versus process evaluations, versus these other types of things. But I don't think that they're all that different. Yep.
What if, though, for the research you were just trying to figure out what is out there, not saying what is effective?
Like they're doing some sort of review study? Yeah,
or like environmental scan or anything like that, and you're not actually trying to evaluate something.
Right, and that's something that will happen in evaluation and in research, right? Like when right now you're coming up with your intervention, you're trying to say, what is out there, what have people done, what might I be able to use for my own intervention? Both people in research and evaluation will probably do that, right? But once you've started to implement something, then evaluation is sort of trying to always refine the intervention. I think research is also always trying to refine the intervention, but it's a little bit different. And you can see sort of hypothesis, key questions, make research recommendations, recommendations based on key questions, publish results, report to stakeholders. To me, that's just all artificial. Okay? And one of the things that I argue is that because we've sort of put evaluation on another side away from research, we end up with lots and lots of before and after studies of lots of our public health interventions. Right? So you're on the ground, you work for the Saskatoon Health Region. Pamela, are you online? Pamela was talking to me today about some evaluation method. I can't remember what it was called now. Where essentially what we're looking at is sort of a matrix of different intervention components, something like a balanced scorecard, right? Balanced scorecard.
Hello.
Pamela?
Yeah, the balanced scorecard. Oh wow, I'm being put on the spot. Where is it? So, in reality, I challenged Dr. Fuller this morning to tell me how process evaluation, outcome evaluation, and formative evaluation could be used more like the language we talk about in public health. And so I'm being challenged to do that in my job. And I had done some research and I've heard about the balanced scorecard a lot. And what it is a series of 4 quadrants. And applying the balanced scorecard in business is a little bit of a different twist than applying it in health. And so the people out there who are smart have designed a balanced scorecard for public health. And I've shared that article with Dr. Fuller because it really has a lot of promise. And so one quadrant is about health determinants and status, and I liken that to the outcomes I would expect from programs. So reduced rate of falls in seniors. Another quadrant was community engagement, and I really see that like balancing measures, and we don't talk a lot about that in the courses, but if you dive into some of the other quality improvement frameworks, balancing measures are like client satisfaction surveys, needs assessments. And another quadrant is resources and services and integration and responsiveness, and I saw a lot of the indicators there being process-type indicators. And so I've said, how can I fit this and use this in the real world? Because I really like this, and it speaks to the people I work with better, I think, than precede, proceed, and re-aim I'm not even familiar with. So is that okay?
What's
Dr. Fuller?
Can you see the screen? Which one did I miss? Social determinants, community resources, and I missed one box.
Integration and responsiveness.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so we have some other new element for another type of model, right, for thinking about how we design, refine programs, interventions. Balanced scorecard. And this is what people are using in Saskatoon Health Region and BC Interior Health Region, okay? Now, why would I be critical of this? What's all wrapped up together? What? Soup. So why is this a good or bad soup? Yeah, so one of the reasons I would be critical of this type of approach, just looking at it right now, is to say, well, it's easy to fill in the boxes, but it's really hard to sort of identify what are the mechanisms and relationships between the different boxes, right? And I think that that's more the spirit of what we're trying to do with program evaluation, is to say, okay, let's fill in the boxes, but let's try to really understand the links, the mechanisms that link the boxes, right? And this doesn't necessarily give us a great way to do that. It might be something we want to think about, and you know, we can see that we could probably really easily integrate another type of logic model or the logic of other logic models, right? We could say, okay, the social determinants are our outcomes. Those are primary outcomes. Community is something like the context of the intervention. Resources are, like Pam said, the process. Integration and responsiveness is like the implementation process, reaching target population, that type of thing, right? So that's why I wanted to get everyone thinking about when you see one of these, or when you see a logic model, or when you see a pre-seed, proceed, all filled out nice, take a step back and think, okay, what are the causal linkages that they're talking about, and do those make sense? Because the box is really nice, but what's behind the box is more important. Okay, and then yes.
Hi, sorry, that's really loud. That's a really good point, because I think that a lot of times when the balanced scorecard or dashboard indicators are used, they're really taken from another process. And in this case, this is a department level evaluation method. And so all the programs, which there's 9 or 10 in the health region I work for health protection, all have to make a logic model. And it's those in-between if-then statements that will help us fill these out. So for instance, the determinants of health, or the health status, that will be the 9 programs' long-term outcomes. And the if-then links that's formed between activities and short-term outcomes will become the process indicators and the balancing measures, the client satisfaction. And so I'm really trying to make those connections, because alone this is definitely doesn't have that linkage. But now I have to link an entire department to each other, all towards the same vision and mission. And so these never stand alone. They are we feed into this from individual component programs and individual logic models in this case.
Right, exactly. And that's anyways, that's the idea. Think beyond the logic model, think beyond whatever type of model you're using, and think about what's behind it and how it all fits together. And then think about evaluation. So, just like we talked about this sort of tension between research and evaluation, and this notion that lots of evaluation type of studies or type of programs tend to rely on before and after studies. And just like we heard, before and after studies are often garbage, right? Because they don't control for lots of different types of confounding. They don't control for lots of different types of bias. And our conclusions the conclusions that we can reach from looking at or researching a before and after study might not be that strong, right? In terms of one thing causing another thing, right? That's what we're after, right? One thing causing another thing. And what I'm going to argue is that we as a group need to think more about how we design interventions and how we design the evaluation of interventions. So EPI, your classic EPI sort of hierarchy of study design. Anyone remember that? What is it? What's first? What's the top single study? Single study, no like meta-analyses or anything like that. RCT, then what's next? Cohort study, then what's next? Case control, then what's next? Cross-sectional study, and then our ecological studies, okay? I mean, you can break it down a little bit more. But one of the things that I want to get you thinking about a little bit is that space between the cohort study and the RCT. There's a lot of space there, okay? There's a lot of different types of study designs within RCTs that we can think about using for evaluating more sort of community level interventions. And there's a lot of designs that sort of combine elements of cohort studies and RCTs or semi-randomized studies that we might think about using for our evaluation of a more public health type intervention. So just for example, there was cluster randomized control trials where you randomize at some group level, like you randomize classrooms or randomize schools to some intervention. There's step wedge randomized control trials where you stagger the implementation of the intervention. So I get it today, some other person in the class gets it 2 weeks later, some other person gets it 2 weeks later, and that's randomized. Crossover randomized control trials where you just receive both the treatment and the control. and preference trials where you either get to pick what you want or you're assigned randomly, okay? And these can be used in different situations depending on the type of intervention. And then, so now we're at the Bonnell paper that we talked about, okay? And basically what Bonnell is getting us to think about is, how can we design interventions that attempt to control for the limitations of non-randomization, right? So the limitations of not having randomization. So number one, we don't have randomization. Number two, what if we don't have a good control group or we can't find a good matching control group? And number three, what if we can't have a longitudinal or prospective study? Okay, so they say if you can't randomize, find a good matched control group. If you can't find a good matched control group, do some post hoc adjustment for confounders, but you can't control for unmeasured confounders. Has everyone heard that term before, unmeasured confounders? Yeah? Epi something? So basically those are things that are going to be confounders in the association between some exposure and some outcome, but that we haven't measured so we can't include in some statistical type of adjustment. Okay, what if you don't have a good control group? What if you can't find a good control group? Well, what you can do instead is to compare the rates in your treatment group to the general population. So maybe it's not the best because maybe they don't match exactly, but you're getting some way to control for secular trends, what's happening generally in the population, and you're controlling for some average level of whatever your outcome is. And then if you can't follow up, you can obviously do retrospective studies, okay? So when you're thinking about this type of design, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. There's some classic texts on, and so there's two classic textbooks, Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Research, and the update is Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Generalized Causal Inference, okay? There's like 60 different study designs in these books, okay? And they outline sort of exactly what the design is good at controlling for, what it's not good at controlling for, why you might want to use it, why you might not want to use it, okay? And they're really good resources exactly for this type of work that we're trying to do. We're trying to do sort of more rigorous evaluations of general public health interventions, but maybe we can randomize, maybe we can't, but how can we try to get at a better type of experimental design or type of design for our study? On Blackboard, I put up a paper that's Shadish. So Shadish wrote that 2001 textbook. He also wrote just a paper, kind of a summary of the textbook called The Renaissance of Quasi-Experiments or something. That will give you a start. Okay, so when you're starting to think about designing your intervention, take a look at that Shadish paper that you have on Blackboard, go to the library, get this book, and sort of say, okay, what can I do? What type of designs are out there? Because again, like I said, there's a big space between RCT and a cohort study. There's a lot of different things you can do to control for different biases that might be more or less affecting your type of study. Okay, so your next task for your group, and remember if you have online students in your group, connect with them now, is start thinking about an intervention, a study design for your intervention. So you're designing an intervention, you have some type of intervention, you're delivering some program, you're trying to affect some outcome. What type of study design are you going to use to study that intervention? And don't say before and after study because I'm going to be angry if you do. Okay? So pull up that Shadish paper, try to start thinking about how you might control for confounding, control for recall bias, control for matching, try to have a little bit stronger design than a before and after study. Ready? Go. What do you mean for intervention study for you? So like your outcome is HIV, HIV, so you had exposed previously like some type of intervention, right? You were so for your evaluation, what is one you want the person to evaluate? You probably have to do both, right? But so what is your study for your process evaluation? We want to study how well you want to study how well
So yeah, so like, first of all, I think it's 4, right? And then you just have to so then this one is measured. Then you have to go to that. Do that. And then you have it right here for and then you also measure your guys yourself. So you got to variance. And then you have to take it out. Then you have another thing and it's looking at
Last minute. One more minute. Okay, you got 40. Okay, let's bring him back in. Okay, so how did that go? Did you design? I didn't. Why? Fix recognize. That was hard. Why?
Our group personally struggled with coming up with appropriate control groups that didn't overlap with what we were trying to study in our intervention. So coming up with the controls and not screwing it up.
Okay, good. Yeah, coming up with controls is really hard, right? This is classic epidemiology, right? It's hard to find good controls. What else is hard? Lots of the groups often came back to the before and after study and went, oh, I'm not allowed to do that. Right? So I think two of the things to sort of keep in mind are, if you start coming back to that before after study idea, think about time and think about controls. Because those are the two things that at the basic we really always want to add. Even if our controls aren't that great, at least we have something, right? Even if we're doing a repeat cross-sectional study where we have like 5 or 10 cross-sectional surveys in a row, at least we have some idea of time, right? We just don't have pre and post. We have, 10 measures. It's just pushing it a little bit further. You don't have to go crazy and do a crazy study. And one of the groups said, our intervention is in the province of Saskatchewan. It's a province-wide intervention in schools. And they really wanted to stick to that intervention. And I said, well, that's great, but if you have something that you want to stick to like that, you still need to think about what's a good control and how can you look at that over time. And they said, well, Manitoba is a good control. We'll compare Saskatchewan to Manitoba pre-post intervention and maybe over 5 years after. That's totally appropriate, right? That's just pushing it a little bit further, pushing that design a little bit further, and it makes it a lot more plausible for anybody to look at that study and say, okay, I kind of believe your result, right? Rather than just a pre-post that you're going to say, no, I don't believe you. Okay, so we have two options at this point. We have a quick break, and we can blaze through the data section, or we can have no break, and we can still blaze through the data section. Who votes for break? No one. Okay. Does anyone online vote for break? Blaze away, they said. Okay, so basically what we're going to talk about now, and I'll make the announcement anyways. I just kind of got word that I'm going to be giving a SAS programming workshop sometime. Woo! Okay, so what we're going to talk about very briefly is data, where to get it, and what to do with it. Okay? I think that some of it seems straightforward and some of it's not, and hopefully you'll learn a couple of things. So where to get it? The Social Science Research Lab here at the U of S is actually a really good resource for help with data analysis. They have tons of resources. You can pay them to do data analysis for you. They have the social spatial, what is it called? I can't remember. The spatial lab, okay? So basically to get data, you can conduct your own surveys, right? my work with the Bixby studies, we've worked with survey companies, Environics, Ipsos, all those things you hear, political polls. Those companies also offer services, right? It's like, I need a random sample of 2,000 adults in Saskatoon. They're like, okay, I can do that for you, right? Here's the bill, it's $80,000 or whatever, but they can do that for you. So if you want to conduct a survey, there's lots of different ways to do it. There's also data that's specifically available to researchers, okay? Lots of this is statistics in Canada, Statistics Canada data. Has anyone heard of the Research Data Center? Sky RDC, it's called. Okay, so on the second floor of the library, there's the Sky RDC, which houses essentially all of the Statistics Canada data that you can imagine. There's surveys like the National Population Health Survey, which is a 17-year longitudinal study of 20,000 adults, okay, which has self-report measures on thousands of different questions. Okay, there's the SLID, Survey of Labor and Income Dynamics, if you're interested in sort of economic stuff. There's the General Social Survey. There's the Canadian Community Health Survey, microdata, so individuals. So those Canadian Community Health Surveys, it's changed a bit over time, but let's say it's yearly repeat cross-sectional surveys of about 40,000 people in Canada every year. So to access that data, basically what you need to do you need to have a supervisor, you need to write a proposal, you send that to StatCan, and then they say, yep, come on in. You get a secure key card thing, and you can go in there and you can do some data analysis, okay? It's a really good way to learn. It's a really good way to get access to lots of really nice data. There's also the Health Quality Council, so they're over at Innovation Place. They house all of the health ministry data, so any of your health data is there. I can go and play with it if I want. Basically, if you break your leg, there's an international classification of disease code that means you broke your leg, and we can look at all of that. We can look at all the drugs you've been prescribed. We can look at all kinds of different stuff at Health Quality Council. And then there's publicly available Stats Canada data. So the census, the National Household Survey, which is sort of the new, crappier census. And then there's the Canadian Community Health Survey public use microdata files, so they call them PUMF, which are essentially aggregated files. So it's not like your individual record, but it's aggregated to the health region level, I think. So you can go and analyze that data. And then there's this really great guy called Nathan Yao. Click on that one. So if you're into data or you think you might be into data, Flowing Data is a really good resource. And this guy who runs Flowing Data has basically started to put together a list of sort of international places where you can get data. So if you're looking at universities, if you're looking at news, you can get data from New York Times, geography data. Tiger is all the US geography data, sports data, world data, politics data, all kinds of stuff. Okay? So if you're interested or if you're working on some problem or you want to try to start playing with some data, just go get some public data and start playing with it. Flowing Data. Where'd I go? Okay, and then what to do with it? So you found some data. What do you do? So one of the things that I'm going to be very honest about is that I think it's critically important that your data be in open source formats, your data and your code and all of the sort of bits of information that are related to your data. So open source formats are CSV. What is that? Anybody know? Comma separated value or text files. Okay, it could be tab separated or some other type of separator. And that your data dictionaries are also publicly available. So your data dictionary is that big PDF document or Word document that explains what the variable name is, how the variable is coded, all of that. So this is what it looks like in SPSS. And then obviously with any data set, especially if you're working with it, especially if you create it, so you had a survey done, you're in charge of the data, it's crucially important to have a data dictionary. Open source, again, PDF or online, publicly available, variable names, descriptions, codings, recodings. And here's a really good example of, this is Statistics Canada. So this is their, one of their income questions. They have like 30. Income underscore Q2 is the variable name. The previous variable name highlighted in gray is income E underscore 2. What is your main source of income? These are the 14 different categories. And if it's recoded, they'll have another section on the bottom that says recoded as income underscore Q2 underscore recode. And they'll have it coded as like 4 categories or something, right? So that you can follow along what's going on with the data. So this is a yes. A no is to have all your data in some proprietary format like SPSS. Okay, in SPSS you can give the values, you can have sort of the variable name, the type of variable, the label, the values, and all of that stuff. But I don't use SPSS. And if I want to get that out of there, it's really hard. Okay, so it's a lot easier for me to just have it in a PDF document and be able to use whatever software I want. I'm not stuck with using SPSS. You can't do Poisson regression with SPSS. Okay, software. So SPSS, you all use in EPI1. Lots of you, some of you know SAS, and you're going to learn some more. Stata, you do EPI3, right? You do Stata and EPI3. Who's heard of or seen or used R? Okay, good. So R is free, open source statistical software. You can do some stats in Excel. Who's heard of PSPP before? Anybody? Okay, I highly recommend you check it out. It's essentially an exact clone of SPSS, written by a bunch of people from the open source community. It's free. The code is almost exactly the same. It's point and click. You can do almost everything you want on PSPP as you can on SPSS. Okay, so if you just need a quick and dirty solution to do some analysis, it's a pretty good option, especially if you're not familiar with Stata code or SAS code or R code. Okay, but analysis, one of the things that I want to get across, and I'll talk about more about this later on, is stats is a lot more than software. And like, just because you know Stata or SAS or R or whatever doesn't mean that you're good or bad at statistics. It just means that you know how to write in some language, right? It's like HTML or it's like any other computer programming language. There's other crucial bits of information that we want when we're doing this type of analysis. So code, version control, and public code. So why do we want to code? So when we looked at in EPI1, no, in Biostats 1, when do you use SPSS? Biostats 1. Right, in Biostats 1, you're like doing stuff, you're doing correlations and crosstabs, and you're pointing and clicking, and then you're outputting the results and you're interpreting those results, right? And then when you want to do it again, what do? You point and click and do it all again, right? Essentially, code makes it so that all we have to do is just highlight a little bit of text and say go, and then we get the same analysis over and over and over again. No more pointing and clicking. So it's reproducible, it saves time, and it reduces errors. Okay, one of the best sort of that didn't help. One of the best sort of ways to think about code is that computers make really big, obvious mistakes. So code makes really big, obvious mistakes, and people make really small, minute, hard to find mistakes. And you'll see that I always tell people when I teach them like the answer's in the code. If you read the like description of what they did in the method section of a paper, oftentimes it's extremely unclear. But if you just looked at their code and said, oh, that's what they did, I know exactly what they did, right? And you'll see that oftentimes a lot of things done with Excel or other types of programs, it's really easy to just sort of make a little mistake, and that just gets reproduced and reproduced and reproduced. So yeah, and the other idea behind code is that imagine someone you've never met will be using the code 2 years from now. In law, they use the hit by a bus test. If you get hit by a bus tomorrow, some lawyer who's taking over your files should be able to pick up your files and in 15 minutes figure out what's going on with each one of your clients. Okay? It's the same thing with code. If you're doing some data analysis and you get hit by a bus, the next person who picks up that work should be able to pick up your work, figure out what you were doing in 15 minutes to half an hour. Because if not, it's just gone. They're just going to start over, basically. So what does it look like? This is what it looks like in SPSS. What it looks like in R. There's some other things going on there. And then another key thing, do I have it there? No. Another key thing we want is we want some kind of version control. So we want to have copies of the code that are dated in some way that are logical. Okay? You've seen, you've seen some of the files that I've sent. My version control system is dumb, I think, but I just put the year underscore the month underscore the day. That makes the computer think that it makes the computer order it so that the newest one is at the bottom, no matter what the date. If you write January or May or whatever, the dates are all messed up. The months can jump around and the years can jump around. Okay, so that's why I do that. There's all sorts of other elements, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And then public code. So one of the things that's important, especially for you as you're learning, is there's a lot of things that you don't know how to do that you probably understand the statistical concept behind, like linear regression, like chi-square. But if I said write out the code for it, you'd be like, I don't know. I can't write out the code, right? But if someone else has published it, then you can just go, oh, I can just go find that. I understand what it's doing. I'll go and use that code, okay? So what it means is it's reproducible by others. You should get in the habit of trying to publish in appendix, and it's critical for modern research. So I'll give you an example. Where'd it go? Here. I'll just go away there. Abstract. So here's a paper by one of my colleagues, Jana Hirsch, Megan Winters, and they're essentially doing some code to make activity spaces. These are geographic spaces, and I'll find the map. That look like this. So this is a method essentially that we could use to measure some kind of environmental exposure, right? We can calculate on the far left standard deviation ellipse just like a circle around your home postal code, right? Or we could calculate a minimum convex polygon, some type of spatial representation that kind of overlaps with water, or we can calculate a daily path area. So we follow you with the GPS and we say, okay, this is exactly where you went in the entire day. And then what we could do is we could overlay that with, like, let's say some air pollution measure. We could say, how much exposure did you have to air pollution that day? And then we would say, did you have an asthma attack that day? Air pollution is associated with asthma in the simplest method. But we have 3 different ways to calculate those activity spaces. Where did that go? And what they've done here is they published the code with the analysis. So here we have a very nice example of sort of commenting out your code. Activity space processing template created on the date by Jana Hirsch. Description of what it's doing, step 1, 2, 3, 4. Files that you need, files to reproduce. What it's doing, describing what the code is doing. Process, clip GPF files to study area, blah, blah, blah. And then a nice little thing that says, enjoy your activity spaces. Okay, so this is a paper that was published, I think, at the end of 2014 or beginning of 2015. That's a kind of a perfect example of why it's really important for us to do this. Now, Jana Hirsch did all the work to make these, and now if I want to do it, I can just take that code and be like, okay, now I've got my environmental exposure. I don't have to spend half a day coding this all out. And that's it. Are there questions on that? It's a really quick blast, but we're finished early.